Hey friends, we're going to review real quick the first 7 chapters of The Biggest Story. I know it's been a few weeks since I uploaded a video, so we're going to take a quick review and then we'll get started on this week's chapters. So it started out with Adam and Eve, and we talked about how they lived in this perfect garden that God had created for them, but because of a decision that they chose to make, they were kicked out and they were separated from God, so they weren't allowed into this beautiful garden anymore. And then we go on to talk about the flood, how they just kept going further and further down this path they weren't supposed to be on, so God flooded the world. So we learned about the flood with Noah. And then after that, you would think that they would get things right and keep listening, but really they didn't. We talked about Abraham and how he finally had a son named Isaac, and then we go on to talk about Isaac and Jacob and Esau. We keep going. We talk about how God's people were forced into slavery. Sorry, that was a really loud truck. That God's people were forced into slavery for 400 years in Egypt, and how God was really kind of silent during that time. They didn't hear from him. They felt like he was very far from them, but how he eventually sent Moses to deliver them. He was a pillar of fire at night and a cloud to guide them during the day. And then he parted the Red Sea and rescued them from the Egyptian armies. And then after that, we kind of keep seeing how God gives them the rules that they're supposed to follow, mainly the 10 Commandments. But they really didn't do that. They demanded a king. And so even though ultimately God was supposed to be their king, he allowed Saul to start leading them. And then after Saul, you have David that leads them. There's David and Goliath. And then after David is his son Solomon, but we learn that even Solomon, David, and Saul all had their faults as well, and they made bad choices. So God sent prophets, and we learned about Elijah and Elisha, and Amos and Malachi and Jeremiah. And these prophets were sent to warn the people and tell them about what they were doing wrong, but they just did not listen. So it says God gave them every opportunity and 10,000 chances, but still sin and the serpent seemed to be winning until all of a sudden they lost. So that's where we left off with the last chapter. So let's get going on this week's story. We're going to be doing chapter 8. After all these downs and not too many ups, we come to a manger in the little town of Bethlehem. This is where we meet the new Adam, the child of Abraham, the son of David. It's with the stinky shepherds and the singing angels where we see the real deliverer, the king, or the real judge, and the real conqueror. No one understood it completely at the time, but when Mary had her baby, God gave the world the long-expected prophet, priest, and king. God gave his people a new law, a new temple, and a new sacrifice. Best of all, he gave his people a new beginning, just as he promised. Of course, some things were different than people had expected. The stable with the animals and the scandal with unmarried Mary were surprises to most folks. The miracles were remarkable. The teaching was unlike anyone had ever heard. The bumbling band of hand-picked disciples, that was just curious. But the biggest surprise to everyone was that the chosen one of God was chosen by God to die. It just didn't seem right that the one destined to crush the serpent would be crushed himself. So when Jesus, the Christ, the Son of the living God, died on the cross that Friday afternoon, it seemed a shocking, evil beyond belief. And it was. It was the worst thing that's ever happened in the world. But it was also the best thing that's ever happened in the world, just as we would expect from God, and just as God had planned it. We break promises, so God keeps his. We run from God, so he comes to us. We suffer for sin, so the Savior suffers for us. Our story isn't the story of God doing what we can't in order to make up for us doing what we shouldn't. The Christ suffers for our sin so that we might share in his sinlessness. And so deliverers are born to die, things fall apart so they can come together. God kicks his own people out of paradise and then does whatever it takes to bring them back again. And now we get to learn next week about chapter 9. So I pray that that was inspiring for you today. I pray that that was such a reward of learning that his promises are true and that he's always going to provide. If God makes a promise, he always, always, always keeps it. So I pray that today that you are healthy, you are safe, and that you know that you are loved and you are a part of the biggest story ever told. Y'all have a good week.